Albert Camus. Now there's a cool philosopher. But having said that, he denied that he was a philosopher. He's also always mentioned as one of the main existentialist thinkers, but he also denied that he was an existentialist. So a bit of a contrarian. And I think you get that from reading this excerpt that I've given you from his long, short book-length essay called The Myth of Sisyphus, which is not a work of fiction like his perhaps more famous work, The Stranger, which also is cited as an existentialist text. But it's also, it's one of those pieces where there seems to be an awful lot of ideas there to be got out of it, but they're sort of elusive. He doesn't present things. If you wrote a paper like this for me, I would not be happy because he's not making himself clear. But at the same time, it's not necessarily his job to make himself clear because he denies that he's a philosopher. It's sort of to provoke you to have a different view on life. And there's an awful lot of good stuff that does that, including vivid examples, especially his analysis of the myth of Sisyphus. This piece has a very famous beginning, which is, there is but one truly serious philosophical question, and that is suicide. You know, pedants, of course, would say, well, that's not a question. But clearly he means the question is whether or not to kill oneself. And, you know, this seems a bit dramatic because that is not something that most people in the course of their life think about. Well, actually, that's probably not true. There is probably at some point in everybody's life when they think about it, but for most people it's not really taken seriously and it's not really a pressing issue. Now, one person we've seen that it was a pressing issue for is Tolstoy. And there are some parallels between what Camus says and what Tolstoy says. What might be the thing that prompts one to ask this question, or to consider committing suicide? Well, the first example he gives, an apartment building manager who had killed himself. Of him I was told that he had lost his daughter 5 years before, and that it had changed greatly since, that the experience had undermined him. A more exact word cannot be imagined. Beginning to think is beginning to be undermined. That is, and you can think of this in exactly the way that Tolstoy described it. Tolstoy literally said that he had nothing left to stand on when he started asking these questions. But Camus' major contribution in this essay is his analysis of what he calls the absurd. And the absurd is the source of the undermining, as it were. His first mention of this is where he says, "This divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity." So the absurdity is a sense you get that you are not at home in the world, that suddenly you're out of kilter, whereas before everything made sense and you were just going along on little tracks, as it were, feeling at home in the world. When absurdity hits you, that's when you start to be undermined and suicide becomes a serious issue. The analysis of absurdity, he says to begin with, life is absurd, but then he undercuts that. He qualifies that and he says, life is unreasonable, but it's not life itself that is absurd. Okay, what does he mean by life is unreasonable? Well, a good description that brings this alive is the passage where he says, "At the heart of all beauty lies something inhuman, and these hills, the softness of the sky, the outline of these trees, at this very minute, lose the illusory meaning with which we have clothed them, henceforth more remote than a lost paradise. The primitive hostility of the world rises up to face us across millennia. For a second we cease to understand it because for centuries we have understood it solely in the images and desires and designs that we have attributed to it beforehand." What does he mean, the primitive hostility? I've written life, it should be the world. He says that when we feel at home in the world, when the world makes sense to us, it's purely because we have projected onto it something that is not there. That is meaning or reason, that it makes sense, that there is some order to it. So, for example, religion does this. We are told, specifically by, of course, Christianity, which is the religion that Camus would be familiar with, as well as Tolstoy, that there's a plan, that God creates the world with a plan. Everything exists for a reason. So even if you don't understand why there are trees and mountains and so on, there is a reason. It's been given to the world by God. That's what makes the world a reasonable place. There's a sense to it. So even if you can't immediately grasp it, it has one. Camus is writing in a context where he assumes religion is no longer an option. And once one realizes that there is no God and that the universe has not been created according to a plan, then the primitive hostility of the world rises up. There's no reason to it. The world only makes sense to us when we make it make sense by we impose our own views on it. He uses all thought is anthropomorphic. The phrase anthropomorphic means changed to have human qualities. So, for example, Mickey Mouse is an anthropomorphized rodent. You know, rodents don't really wear gloves or walk around on 2 feet. So it's a mouse that has been given human qualities. We do that to the world. We try and we bend the world to fit what is comfortable to us. But that is an illusion. And once you see past that, suddenly the world is strange again. And so the primitive hostility of the world versus the reason with which we cannot help but try to make sense of things, these things come into conflict. And it turns out that we cannot make sense. Reason is incapable of making sense of our existence. And this is, again, a lot like Tolstoy's experience when he tries to use science to make sense of the world or to answer the question, why? What's the point? The same phenomenon is happening here. So the clash between those two things, that is what the absurd is. This is the end of the section before absurd freedom. I said that the world is absurd, but I was too hasty. The world in itself is not reasonable. That is all that can be said. But what is absurd is the confrontation of this irrational and the wild longing for clarity whose call echoes in the human heart. The absurd depends as much on man as the world. So the world is not absurd. It is humans' encounter with the world that produces absurdity. And a contrast with that is, as he says early in the next section, if I were a tree amongst trees, a cat amongst animals, this life would have meaning, or rather, the problem would not rise, for I should belong to this world. If you're part of this world, if you don't have reason, then everything is okay. Maybe this is why Tolstoy resorted to faith, abandoning the use of reason to try to understand the world. He wanted to be a tree amongst trees, a cat amongst animals. It's only this ridiculous reason, as he says, that sets me in opposition to all creation. So that's the absurdity. Oh, and a later example, he says the primitive hostility of life isn't just in the inhuman, it's in everything that we encounter. And there's this example of the man behind the glass partition. You see a man behind the glass partition, and his dumb show becomes weird and alienating. That is, this reminds me of an incident described by Oliver Sacks. If you're not familiar with Oliver Sacks, he was a neuroscientist who dealt with many interesting brain conditions. They made a movie based on one of his books called Awakenings with Robin Williams and Robert De Niro. And he wrote a book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, about someone who literally, because of his strange brain condition, tried to pick his wife up and put her on as if she were a hat. So he describes all of these strange brain conditions. And one incident described in there is where a group of patients who are aphasic, who don't have language, were watching a speech by Ronald Reagan, who was president at the time, on the TV. And he was giving a serious speech, and they were all busting out laughing because they couldn't take him seriously. They saw that it was kind of a show, that it was all fake. And that's the sort of experience you can get when something is slightly off about reality, that you realize, wait a minute, everything is a little bit weird. If you want this experience, watch a movie by David Lynch. Blue Velvet is a great example of this, precisely because Blue Velvet does this to a small American town. Like some of his other movies are, weird and outlandish, like Eraserhead. But the point about Blue Velvet is on the face of it, it looks like classic American apple pie small town. But everybody's acting a little bit off, and there's a weird dark undercurrent. This is the experience that you get when you encounter the world as it really is, not as we project on it to be. Okay, so our experience of our place in the world is as an absurd one, that there is no reason for us here, that we don't belong here, that so for example, he says, before encountering the absurd, the everyday man lives with aims, a concern with the future, or for justification, with regard to whom or what is not the question. Now, there are forms of justification that Camus rejects. So, for example, if you say, I justify my life because my life has a reason because of God. Well, that's wrong. That's mistaken. You're just fooling yourself. That is the hope that you have got to get past. So again, Camus, this essay is a direct rejection of Tolstoy's solution, the thing that enabled Tolstoy to go on, to get past this arrest of life that he experienced. Camus rejects that. And the other one is to find purpose in something bigger than yourself, like a political movement or something like that. Again, this is looking for something that isn't there. This, I think we'll see, is in direct rejection of Susan Wolf's suggestion that we'll see in her paper. So, before encountering the absurd, the everyday man lives with aims. He weighs his chances. He counts on someday, his retirement or the labor of his sons. This is what's going to make life good for him. He still thinks that something in his life can be directed. In truth, he acts as if he were free, even if all the facts make a point of contradicting that liberty. You're not in control. You can't make a difference in this alien world. But after the absurd, after suddenly you've had this experience where everything has shifted slightly. So again, where Tolstoy experienced an arrest of life, this experience of encountering the absurd is a bit like that. The contemporary American philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote an essay called The Absurd, and his analysis of it is that you have this experience of the absurd when you sort of step out of yourself and look down on yourself. Everybody knows that if you stand on a tall building and look down on the people walking by, they look like ants and they look alien, and you think, what's the point of them? What's the point of their life? Look at them. They're scurrying around thinking their life is important, but from my perspective, they're just ants. They don't have a point to their lives. And when you are able to do that, this moment when you're living your life, you're a cat amongst animals. When you're not thinking about it, you're just walking around, got to do this, got to do that, got to earn pay, got to get promoted. You haven't encountered the absurd yet. You've got to have this moment where you see life more clearly. And for Nagel, it was taking the perspective of the universe. Stepping out of your own first-person perspective, and you sort of look at yourself from a third-person perspective. And that clash, Nagel suggested, was the absurd. Something like that is what Camus is suggesting, that when you take a look at things as they really are, you will see that there is no point to what you're doing, and nothing you can do can be justified. After the absurd, everything is upset. That idea that I am, my way of acting as if everything has a meaning, all that is given the lie in vertiginous fashion. That means vertiginous is like the feeling of vertigo, like, whoa, suddenly a steep drop is in front of you, by the absurdity of a possible death. Thinking of the future, establishing aims for oneself, having preferences, all this presupposes a belief in freedom, even if one occasionally ascertains that one doesn't feel it. But at that moment, I am well aware that higher liberty, that freedom to be, which alone can serve as the basis for truth, does not exist. Death is there as the only reality. Okay, so is he suggesting you should kill yourself? No, and this is where we get Sisyphus, the absurd hero. And because he says Camus' response is a rebellious one. Instead, Camus doesn't say, oh, look at us, look at absurdity, life is shit, might as well just give up. Camus says, look at us, life is shit, so shake your fist in the face of life. You embrace absurdity and you rebel against it. That is why Sisyphus is the absurd hero, because Sisyphus is someone who has been punished by the gods. That is one thing about Sisyphus. He describes the story here. And Sisyphus is actually a good guy. He's trying to save humans from death. And you might say philosophers or priests try to save humans from death by saying, don't worry, death is not the end. Sisyphus tries to do that, but is punished because you can't do that. The gods will not allow that. Pluto, the god of the underworld, saw that his kingdom was depopulated and he wasn't happy. So they punished Sisyphus, and they punished Sisyphus by telling him to struggle and to struggle pointlessly, that he is trapped in this pointless, repetitive task. He has to push this rock to the top of a hill, and when he gets to the top of the hill, it rolls down again, and he has to repeat it ad infinitum. This is all that he will ever do. Now, Sisyphus is always used as the very picture of meaninglessness, pointlessness. And that is exactly why Camus seizes upon him, because Sisyphus, unlike most of us, has realized, he cannot help but realize, that everything he does is pointless, is meant to be a punishment, as it were. Remember in Tolstoy's essay, he says he gets this feeling that life is a cruel trick played on him. Well, Sisyphus knows it is a cruel trick played on him by the gods. But, how does this end? He says, this struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. And he repeats this slogan. Sisyphus says, all is well. How on earth can you say that, given the horrific fate that Sisyphus is? Most people would say it would be better to be dead than to be Sisyphus. But Camus is saying no. The absurd hero doesn't commit suicide. The absurd hero recognizes that you cannot have, that there is no quality to life, that you cannot have one life being better than another, because the only way that could happen is if there was a reason for life and your life had better achieved that reason. But once you recognize that there is no point to life, there is no way that any kind of life can have a quality that is comparable or better or worse than any other. So all that you can shoot for, if you're the absurd hero, is quantity. You shake your fist at the world and you just say, live. Now, what are you supposed to do? Anything you want. You seize on activities knowing that they are pointless. In a part of this essay that is not included, he considers different approaches to the absurd. Like Don Juan is a lover who just is an obsessive. Don Juan syndrome is kind of sex addiction, who just goes from one conquest to the next. His life is pointless, but he's pursuing it, and he is rebelling against the absurdity of his action by just repeatedly doing this. One does not discover the absurd without being tempted to write a manual of happiness. What? There is but one world, however. Happiness and the absurd are two sons of the same earth. They are inseparable. It would be a mistake to say that happiness necessarily springs from the absurd discovery. I should say so. It seems very depressing. It happens as well that the feeling of the absurd springs from happiness. I conclude that all is well, says Oedipus, who, if you remember, was also a tragic Greek hero who kills his father and sleeps with his mother by accident, and ends up blinded, but is still able to find happiness. The lucidity that was to constitute his torture. This is Sisyphus. In a part of the essay, Camus says, I'm interested in Sisyphus. What's he thinking in the trudge down to get to the rock? He pushes the rock up, and while he's pushing it, he's kind of caught up in the struggle. But then when the rock rolls down, he's standing there for a second and he's looking and he's thinking, I got to do it all again. It was all pointless. And he's sort of trudging back down. And Camus saying, I'm interested in him then. And he imagines him sort of rebelling, like, as he puts it, the lucidity, the awareness of the pointlessness of his life and the fact that he has to do it again and again. The lucidity that was to constitute his torture at the same time crowns his victory. There is no fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn. That is, the gods wanted to punish Sisyphus by robbing his life of all meaning. That's us. Our life has no meaning. Should we be depressed by it? No. We should rebel against it, and we should find a kind of perverse joy in scorning this punishment. Yeah, life is meaningless. I'm going to get as much of it as I can. I'm never going to commit suicide. I'm going to live life as long as life will give me and go out on my own terms. Was there one more thing? I haven't mentioned weariness. This weariness, it comes up. Yes, here's another great quote from Camus. This again, talking about the moment when the absurdity hits you. The stage sets collapse. It's as if you've been in this world that you think is the real world, and then it all falls down and it's fake, like a film set. Rising, streetcar, 4 hours in the office or the factory, meal, streetcar, 4 hours of work, meal, sleep, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, according to the same. This was your life before the absurd hit you. This path is easily followed most of the time, but one day the why arises, again, just like Tolstoy, and everything begins in that weariness tinged with amazement. This is important. Weariness comes at the end of the acts of a mechanical life, but at the same time, it inaugurates the impulse of consciousness. So, weariness sounds bad. It sounds like a crisis. Tolstoy experienced it as a crisis, but for Camus, it's good, because this is the moment when you're conscious, you are aware. This is uniquely human. Only humans can encounter absurdity. Cats don't think about them. Cats don't sit and think, why am I doing this? Why am I chasing mice? What's the point of it all? They just don't do that because they don't have the consciousness that we do. So the fact that we are able to experience absurdity is, in a sense, the essence of humanity. And that's why, in some sense, we've got to, as humans, we have sort of a duty to live life as absurd heroes, to rebel against it, and just to this is an ongoing process. That's another thing, just like with Sisyphus, because it's so easy to get sucked back into the idea that life does have a point. Hope springs eternal. You keep wanting to say, oh, maybe, the point of life is to help others. No, it isn't. There is no point to life. You have to keep overcoming that, and despite that, not committing suicide. Realizing that there is no point, and yet living as much life as you can. So that's absurdity. It's kind of it's a rallying cry, but some people regard it as a little bit self-congratulatory. It's too, I don't know, it sprinkles fairy dust on human existence as if it's this tragic play, and some people regard that as a bit melodramatic. But, Camus, well, he's not French, he's Algerian, but writes in French, so they tend to be a bit dramatic. But it is, I think, a life-changing work, the myth of Sisyphus. That is why, perhaps, Camus won the Nobel Prize for Literature. There you go.